Welcome to No Rares Required, episode 41, Simic Scry or Legendries. The Simic or green-blue color pair has the worst win rate on 17 lands, despite it looking like one of the strongest decks before we all had a chance to play. And as the set has evolved, Simic is still not improving. So let's try to change that. The archetype's theme is Scry synergies, and its biggest downfall is it is slow to get going, lacks interaction, and is easily disrupted by your opponent's interaction. In full disclosure, I'm viewing this episode as a challenge to get Simic to work, and I recommend if you are new to drafting Lord of the Rings to avoid the archetype. But if you're up for the challenge, I'll discuss my two strategies to Simic that have worked for me, especially during in-pod drafting for competitions or tournaments. This week there will be two draft skeletons because my two approaches are so dramatically different. And on a side note, this could be a reason that the archetype has a lower win rate. The color pair might be torn in two directions, so it takes some draft prowess and focus to navigate. First up is my approach to the archetype's theme of Scry. The more Scry, the better. You're aiming to have at least 11 cards or so that either trigger Scry or benefit off of a Scry trigger. This skeleton is running 13 creatures, which is a little bit on the low side, but there's an argument that Deceive the Messenger counts as a creature since it amasses and creates a 1/1 token. One of the upsides to this approach, and why I really like it for competitive situations, is that it is made up of cards that no other deck wants to draft outside of a handful of cards like Ithilien Knots or In's Fury, which can just as easily be Glorious Gale or Birthday Escapes or Soothing of Smeagol. It leans heavily on Arwen Undamamil, which then makes any instant speed Scry like Ithilien Knots and Greyhaven's Navigator into a combat trick. The other upside is since this deck scries so much, it is nearly impossible to flood. The majority of the interaction, like Deceive the Messenger, Isolation at Orthanc, and Horses of Brunnen, are in blue, so I recommend it being your base color, at least for the Scry strategy. My other build is mostly green and is the Legendries deck. I briefly mentioned this build in my guide to Celestia, since Frodo Baggins triggers a ring tempt every time a legendary creature enters the battlefield, but the approach is largely the same. As you can see, there are hardly any blue cards, but I can't stress enough how impactful Deceive the Messenger is in an archetype that struggles to find early interaction. The overall approach, which works for any base green archetype, is draft up to 4 mini partings, play at least 8 forests, then cut a land for each mini partings. For example, the build above would be only running 13 lands, ideally 8 forests, 2 islands, 1 plains, 1 swamp, and 1 great hall. It sounds like a best of 1 strategy to take advantage of the hand smoother, but it also works in best of 3, and it is my favorite deck to play in the format. Since the majority of your creatures are legendary, you also want to pick up a Great Hall of the Citadel. Then you just pick up busted legendaries like Faramir, Prince of Ithilien, and Old Man Willow. You'll have less food synergies than being base Celestia, but you can more easily splash the Mouth of Sauron, which benefits off your strategy of playing mini partings early. Then since we're base green, we lean into the In's Fury 4-power synergies of Mirror Guardian and Enraged Hjorn, Pathfinder for additional off-color fixing and ramp, and Mushroom Watchdogs works pretty well as long as you have the 4 mini partings to give them an early food token. And I decided to include Mirkwood Spider, since giving your legendary creatures like Frodo Baggins Death Touch is a fun time, and Baggin Porter, since it gets a +1/+1 buff for each legendary that you control. This is one of the more difficult archetypes to build because you need to think about how the pieces synergize with one another, but it is an absolute blast to play. So now that I've given you an idea of my two approaches to Simic, let's dive into the cards individually and cover what helps me decide when to go for each approach. First up is Deceive the Messenger. This is still one of the more undervalued blue commons, and I want 1 or 2 in either my Simic Scry deck or Simic Legendries. Simic lacks interaction, so the first couple of commons that I'll cover are just interaction. For example, Isolation at Orthanc. Both Scry and Legendaries can take a while to get going, but eventually overwhelm your opponent with synergy. Isolation at Orthanc essentially time walks your opponent's play, causing them to redraw it and recast it. It also can hit an army token and just be 4-cost removal. This is another example of a card that I want in both strategies. And my last common that I want, regardless of what strategy I end up in, is Int's Fury. I like it a bit more in the Legendries deck since I'm aiming to play some of the 4-power green commons in base green, and so many Scry creatures are 3-power, but you don't have hard removal options other than this, so you must rely on Int's Fury. Now I'll cover the commons that are specific to the Scry approach. I mentioned the combo of Ithilien Knots and Arwen in the beginning, but I'll mention it again because it's a good one. Arwen gives a creature a permanent +1/+1 counter each time that you Scry, so this can be used to win a combat by triggering a Scry in the middle of their turn or in the middle of combat, and it draws a card. It also works at slowing your opponent down strategy, since you can tap their creature before they attack, or use it to remove a blocker to push for lethal damage. It's a pretty versatile card, but I do want Scry payoffs for it to really shine. Willowind is at its best in the Scry deck. The upside to this card and drafting Simic Scry in general is that no one wants this card, so it's very easy to wind up with 1 or 2. You don't want too many because 5-drop, but you can leverage the Scry trigger the most in Simic Scry. Greyhaven's Navigator is usually a card I look to pair with Glorious Gale, the 2-cost counter target creature, since you can take advantage of the flash and play it if your opponent plays around your counterspell. In this archetype, though, I haven't been impressed with Glorious Gale, since I want to spend my early mana to get the Scry engine going since it is slow to develop. This, like Ithilien Knots, though, can be played as a combat trick if you have Arwen in play. Nimrodel Watcher is only good in a deck that has an excess of Scry triggers. If you can reliably Scry every turn, then this is a 3/1 unblockable creature for 2 that can quite quickly win you the game. One of the ways to ensure you have enough Scry triggers is to prioritize cards that cause repeatable Scry triggers, like Lothlorien Lookout, another card that I only want in the Simic Scry deck that tends to be available very late in the draft. I usually aim to pick up 2 or 3, since it doesn't do much to attack with a 1/3 without a ring emblem, but being able to activate your Scry abilities each turn can snowball if you have Arwen or Chance-Met Elves. Lookout starts to look a lot better if you play Chance-Met Elves on turn 3, attack with Lookout to make Chance-Met Elves a 4/3, then on turn 4 attack, Scry again, and suddenly your opponent is dealing with a 5/4 that is threatening to get even bigger. This card demands removal, and like Nimrodel Watcher, gives you a payoff for leaning fully into the Scry synergies. Now for the commons in the Legendaries approach. I usually wait until the wheel, which is pick 9 and onward, when you see cards for a second time when they wheel, and that's the time that I pick up Mini Partings. But if Mini Partings wheels, then I know I have at least a chance to pick up 4 of them and have a complete playset and do some truly silly things like run 17 creatures and 10 instances or sorceries. Mushroom Watchdogs I only want to play if I have the 4 Mini Partings. It's a great turn to follow up after Mini Partings, and then you can sacrifice a food to attack with a 3/3 Vigilance on turn 3. Outside of that strategy, though, you can find better 2-drops. Like Woe's Pathfinder. Between 4 Mini Partings, 2 Pathfinders, and a Great Hall, you have 7 off-color sources for your off-color legendary bombs. It also helps to ramp to 4-cost creatures, since outside of Mirror Guardian, the 3-cost slot is pretty weak. And since your only hard removal option is Int's Fury, it's nice to include some green cards that synergize with it. Sometimes you've picked up cards like Birthday Escape, or Soothing of Smeagol, or Mirror Guardian, or Enraged Hjorn. They give you the 7 ring temptations that I recommend if you're going for the ring temp strategy. But other archetypes that have access to more 1/1 tokens are better ring tempt decks, so I wouldn't go out of my way. It's more about synergizing with Int's Fury than ring tempt in this archetype. And last is Bag and Porter. With 4 power, it also synergizes with In's Fury, but it also gets +1/+1 for each legendary creature that you control, so it works well anytime I'm aiming to play all the legendaries that I can pick up. And now for the uncommons. There are 4 that stand out for my Scry approach. First and foremost is Arwen Indomitable. So much so that I wouldn't recommend going for the Scry archetype without Arwen. She's a repeatable Scry outlet in the late game with her 6-cost mana sync ability, and she turns all of your instant speed Scrys into potential combat tricks. Celeborn the Wise is also useful as a repeatable Scry outlet, making your Chance-Met Elves and Nimrodel Watchers trigger themselves when they attack can come in handy. You don't need him like you do Arwen, but the synergy is definitely there. The third uncommon is Horses of the Brunnen. I prefer my main color to be blue, so the double pip blue isn't problematic, and this can be such a huge tempo swing. Maybe your Chance-Met Elves are finally at risk of being double blocked, maybe you just want to bounce 2 of their tokens to remove them permanently, and it comes with a Scry trigger. The ring trigger is nice too, but like I mentioned earlier, it's kind of secondary in this archetype. And the last uncommon for the Scry approach is Elrond, Lord of Rivendell. The only other archetype that really looks to play Elrond is Azorius, where you can take advantage of cards like Protector of Gondor that can trigger the Ring Tempt in one play. But making each creature enter the battlefield trigger a Scry is great even if you aren't great at playing multiple creatures in one turn. For the Legendaries approach, you can basically go for any gold multicolored legendary that you want, but I'll list a few of my favorites. The Mouth of Sauron is great as long as you have 11 or so instances and sorceries, which, if you are running the 4 mini partings instead of lands, is very achievable, even in Simic. The other base deck that works quite well for playing 4 mini partings and Great Hall and splashing all of the multicolored legendaries is Selesnya. You'll have a little bit more food synergies if your base is green-white, but even if your only food is off mini partings, Old Man Willow is still a bomb I'm excited to pick up. Frodo Baggins pairs oh so nicely with Mirkwood Spider. If you've got Frodo, don't overlook that synergy. Frodo makes every legendary creature a ring trigger as well, so you might want to lean a little more heavily into cards like Soothing of Smeagol and Birthday Escape if the opportunity arises. And the upside of being base blue-green instead of white is it's easier to splash the blue multicolored bombs like Mouth of Sauron and Bilbo Retired Burglar. I'd much rather play Bilbo than Shadowfax or King of the Oathbreakers, for example. I got absolutely destroyed by a turn 2 Meriadoc Brandybuck followed by a turn 3 Bilbo, courtesy of Great Hall. The treasure tokens help you hit your off-color legendaries, and Bilbo counts as 2 ring temps in 1 card. So like Frodo, you might want to lean into additional ring temptations if you pick this up early. And now for the rares. For the Scry approach, my top rare is Elrond, Master of Healing. Like Arwen, he makes all of your Scrys into buffs, all your instant Scrys into combat tricks, and even better, if you Scry 2, you get to distribute those counters onto creatures. Galadriel of Lothlorien is also a great rare for the Scry deck. While Ring Temptation isn't my main strategy, you do have some cards like Birthday Escape and Soothing of Smeagol that can then be turned into a Scry 3 trigger. The big payoff, though, is every time you Scry, which is ideally every turn in this archetype, you get to reveal the top card of your library, and if it's a land, you get to put it into the battlefield tapped, so she makes your Scrys even better. The last rare worth a mention for the Scry strategy is Rivendell. Being able to use a land to repeatedly trigger a Scry effect is great once you've run out of other options. I'm usually not very high on the rare lands in this set, but in Simic Scry, I recommend picking up Rivendell. And now for the Legendaries approach. There is no better legendary creature than Faramir, Prince of Ithilien. If you are in any white or blue archetype, you should be splashing if you have the opportunity to play this card. It either creates 3/1/1s each turn, or it gives you a card draw. Talk about damned if you do or damned if you don't for your opponent if they don't have removal. And even if they do have removal, the emblem still sticks around for a turn, which I've seen people screw up, so keep that in mind. Shelob is also a great legendary to play off Great Hall. You might even have Mirkwood Spiders for additional Spooter synergy. And for the mythics, there is but one. Good old hippie Radagast the Brown. Better in the legendary deck since, hey, it's a legendary, but also because a fair amount of your creatures in the Scry approach are elves, and Radagast prefers when you have a menagerie of creature types. Those are my two approaches to the worst archetype in Lord of the Rings. I hope they inspired you to not just overlook the archetype when it's open. We have 3 more weeks before Wilds of Eldraine and 2 more archetypes to cover, so if you have a preference between Azorius and Orzhov, let me know in the comments below. Personally, I think Orzhov is looking slightly underdrafted compared to its win rate as we get into the final weeks of the format. If you're watching for the first time, remember to hit like and subscribe for more No Rares required content. Good luck getting those trophies, and I will see you all next week.